Thanks so much for joining us again today, Adam.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
I've been looking forward to this discussion for a long time. I think, Adam, you and I have been discussing this for probably, doing this episode for something like 4 months at this point. And
Yeah,
I think we discussed it even before the Capitol riots gave us this um, like cartoonist example of like the peak of psychedelic narcissism and what can go awry when we saw the so-called QAnon shaman come out all over the news. So this is something that I bring up to people sometimes, psychedelic narcissism, and they've never heard. In fact, the term was new to me as of maybe a year or so ago. And so this may be a term that's new to a lot of people. So we could start. And by the way, I want to clarify for everybody listening. It's not like Adam is expert in psychedelic narcissism, but he is an expert in many things, and he and I just really wanted to have this kind of like dialogue chat about this. And he's got a little personal experience, or a lot of personal experience, to bring to this. But on this subject, Adam, if you could kind of tell us what your personal version, like what your definition of psychedelic narcissism would be, and a little bit about your own story about your dipping your toe into that arena, let's say.
yeah. Thank you for that. I think like the first thing that I would like to do is just give a disclaimer. These topics are extremely complicated and very tricky, and they're very important too because they have a massive impact and they affect like individuals, but also communities as a whole. So talking about these things can be, to some extent triggering and also yeah, it's just complex. But I think I think like the first difference that I would like to make is that narcissism is used a lot nowadays colloquially, right? Like people are like, oh, like that person is narcissist or that person has narcissistic traits and so on and so forth. And just to differentiate kind of like the colloquial use of narcissism from the actual psychiatric diagnosis of narcissistic personality, because that's actually something it's still a diagnostic construct. So it has checklists of different qualities that qualify somebody to have that kind of like label stapled into them. But I think like the use that we're doing is not necessarily the clinical use of narcissism, but just something more colloquial, which is something that is um, inherent and built in to most Western people. Yeah, and by definition, most Westerners, we are narcissists. This is my view on it. Many of the underlying ideologies upon which Western cultures are built, like hyper individualism and so on, kind of like predispose us and prime us towards certain aspects of narcissism, which is, in my sense, is just like an inflated preoccupation with the self. Yeah, like an excessive dwelling and preoccupation with the self. Yeah, like this glorification of the self, this glorification of the individual. And this is a massive part of many psychedelic scenes nowadays because many of the narratives or the stories that we tell about psychedelics, many of them or most of them actually have to do with the individual. Yeah, like psychedelics are for individual healing, psychedelics are for self-knowledge, psychedelics are for personal growth. Most of the times it comes back to me, me, me. I'm doing this because I want to get to certain points. I want to heal, I want to grow, I want to be something else that what I am. But very rarely we go or reproduce narratives that go outside of the individual or the person. So just to clarify, narcissism to some extent is built in every Western person because that's just part of like the cultural baggage and the ideological baggage that we carry as Western subjects to some extent. And I think it's a little bit intensified in Anglo-Saxon and North American cultures just because of the ideological substrate upon which like American culture or other Anglo-Saxon cultures rest. But yeah, so it's not something unique to psychedelic scenes. It just gets amplified and intensified through psychedelic use because of the specific and very interesting qualities of psychedelic substances. Yeah,
Got it. So fantastic. And I love that you differentiated between clinical narcissism and colloquial use because you're right. We do label everyone a narcissist, and whether or not their therapist, should they have one, has labeled them as such is a different
yeah,
different situation. So when we're talking about psychedelic narcissism, we are not talking about somebody used psychedelics and now the DSM-5 says they qualify for clinical narcissism. This is more
exactly.
a discussion of when because you said, narcissism is essentially like a preoccupation with the self. And I see it as that plus often elevating that, like you're preoccupied with that self, and then that self gets elevated perhaps above other selves as maybe like this, kind of this evolution of narcissism. And I think that's a lot of what we may be discussing in the psychedelic community as we see people have certain experiences, then they get obsessed with their experience and what that means, and then suddenly, oh, are we better than the people who haven't had that experience? And so I know that is likely to come up later. So in the not at all narcissistic way, we're going to talk about ourselves, Adam. Let's have you have volunteered to tell us about when you felt you had gone through, because you and I were talking beforehand, the temptation to kind of like lose your one ego and then rebound to have like this greater ego is not uncommon, and a lot of people face it. And so what we want to do in this episode is bring awareness to that. And so gratefully you will be sharing your own story of when you faced that. And so maybe other people can learn from that and say, oh, I'm starting to have those same thoughts. So if you could share a little bit about what you experienced.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like in pretty much every spiritual tradition in history has warned against the dangers of ego inflation. Yeah, this is something that has been known and taught for millennia, probably in every possible way. And it's something that it is very quite common amongst people who dabble in psychedelia. Yeah, like there's certain aspects of a psychedelic experience that can predispose people towards a certain messianic attitude or ego inflation, or kind of an over identification with certain archetypes of the collective unconscious, if you want to use more Jungian terms. Actually, Jung used to speak about this, and he warned a lot after he tried mescaline, actually, in the later years of his life. He warned against unearned wisdom, right? He said, like, these are very powerful tools that can be actually very dangerous for the individuation process because they give people unearned wisdom, like a sort of peek into insights that they hadn't really worked to get, as if it were a shortcut. I don't actually 100% agree with that. I don't think that psychedelics are shortcuts or that every piece of insight that we get through them comes from unearned wisdom. But I think the important aspect of it is just the realization that whatever insights or whatever realizations we do have through the psychedelic experience do not end at it, but actually require maximum attention throughout a very long period. So actually we can ground them into daily mundane life, as opposed to just being something ethereal that remains in the realm of intellectual insight. So that's kind of like the trick aspect of it. Like, if we really want to embody the realizations and the insights that we get through the psychedelic experience, that takes a lifetime of awareness and attention to our own internal and social processes. So, yeah, I mean, something that I have come to see in a lot of people, including myself. And I don't know, I'm just gonna, like, maybe for your listeners, like, my background is in mental health, both from the perspective of psychology and more recently from the perspective of anthropology. So I become very fond of ethnographic and auto-ethnographic approaches. Auto-ethnographic approaches basically mean that a lot of my insights come from examining my own experience. And so many of these things that I speak about, many of the things that I want to present or talk about, they come from both like a third-person observation of like the research that I am doing and that I've been doing, and like doing interviews and working with other people and like looking at what their processes have been like, but also, and more importantly, from a first-person experience, which is like really having insight into my own internal world and my own processes. So yeah, I mean, ego inflation, spiritual narcissism, messianic episodes, all of these are things that are fairly common within people. I mean, both people that are in some sort of spiritual or psychedelic path. And definitely I can see phases of my life where I have gone through all of these things. And I mean, another thing that I think is very important is that one thing that I found is that this kind of development is not linear. It's not like you go through these phases and then you move forward and you're in a different phase. It can be very cyclic. Yeah, we may go through phases of inflation and then kind of grounding and then maybe we go through some messianic phase and then we get out of it. And it can be like just something we pass, but it can be something that kind of like recurs in cycles. Like we go through cycles of these things. So so from my own experience, I've definitely seen that. I mean, I went through a massive phase of messianic inflation probably a decade ago or so. Like when I first started like working heavily with like different plant medicines and psychedelics, I went through this phase of believing that I was one of the chosen ones who could see beyond the veil of the matrix. I was very deep into a conspiracy rabbit hole for a couple of years. Kind of like just standard conspiracy, kind of like Illuminati, David Icke, Alex Jones. I mean, this is more than a decade ago. This is probably 12, 13 years ago. Which is something else that we're gonna probably touch on, is this aspect of conspirituality, which has become a word. It's become
a word.
More of a it's become a word. It's not a new word, by the way. This is a word that was coined quite a while ago in an academic paper, but it has kind of like become revived because it's become very relevant in light of the Q movement and kind of like the Trump thing. Coronavirus has brought all of that to the surface. So like that conspiritual aspect that is very prevalent in psychedelic scenes is something that I've known very well firsthand because I was deep in it for quite a long time. I spent maybe 2 or 3 years like very deep into that conspiritual mindset, where every day I just spent going on YouTube rabbit holes, doing psychedelics, like learning about, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Freemasons, and the Illuminati, and all these conspiracies, which made a lot of sense until they didn't. Yeah, and it's just one of the aspects of these things. Is like, well, at some point, it is important to actually get the epistemic tools that are required to actually make better sense of information. And I think like this is one of the key aspects that I do want to focus on, is the epistemic aspect of how do we actually make sense of the psychedelic experience in conjunction with all of the different narratives and stories that oftentimes go along with psychedelics, from the perspective of both medicalization, from the perspective of like new age ideologies, and also from the perspective of like the more underground conspiritual narratives that oftentimes hijack spiritual experiences or psychedelic experiences to kind of like feed their own paradigms. So
well, first off, this is all new information to me, so I'm just as riveted by this story as anybody listening. I'm like, because Adam is great at posting things that highlight these, conspirituality players, and I adore reading them because it's one of my pet peeves is to see, good people get kind of worked down these rabbit holes by maybe some people that have gone off a little on the psychedelic narcissism end. But now to hear your own personal story where you were deep in it, how you said, you had to develop some tools to help work yourself out. Can you talk a little bit about how you even recognized that that was a place you needed to get out of, and that what some of those tools were? If somebody happens to be either down the rabbit hole themselves or maybe has a friend who is, how can one realize they're in that place and start to work out of it?
That's a good question. My partner Jennifer has a great term for it. I don't know if actually she came up with it, but she uses it a lot. She calls it recreational paranoia. And recreational paranoia is basically kind of like this leisure activity, going deep into rabbit holes of conspirituality and paranoid conceptions of things. That is, for the most part, purely recreational, except in the last few months, we have seen what happens when that recreational paranoia stops being recreational and actually manifests as a reality in the real world that has an impact on millions of people. And we saw that with the Q shaman, for example, storming the Capitol. We have seen this more and more with anti-vaxxer movement, particularly when it comes to COVID and so on and so forth. Like things that maybe a decade ago or 12 years ago were still within that realm of recreational paranoia suddenly have gotten so much steam and reached such a momentum that actually have become relevant for everybody, whether we realize it or not. They're in the front pages of newspapers, something that is, pretty much anybody and everybody, and I'm sure your listeners will relate to it. Like all of us know at least a few people who have been hijacked by the QAnon movement, which is probably the epitome of what conspiranoia can come to when let rampant, and what conspirituality can lead to when it is not addressed communally. So in my case was the safety will was my community. It was my family, it was my friends, it was the people around me who were able to say like, hey, like you've gone a little bit too much off the deep end, and we would like you to come back. And like that's the one thing that I think is the most important aspect of all of this conversation, because we were speaking at the beginning of this conversation about the massive impact that hyper individualism and the alienation and disconnection from the social and the cultural and the environmental in Western cultures has on people. And I think like this recreational paranoia, this conspirituality goes hand in hand precisely with that hyper individualism and that complete disconnection from any sense of meaningful community and any sense of meaningful connectedness to something bigger, whether that's nature or the mystery, whatever people want to call it. In my case, the social aspect was primary. Yeah, it was my family, it was my friends, just saying like, hey, like you're going, yeah, like you're gonna leave it too far, and like we miss you. We miss the person you were, and we want you to, we want you to know that you're held, and whenever you choose to come back to us, your place is still safe with us, and we're still taking care of you, and we're still like holding that space for you. And that's something that I have also been vocal about with people who have loved ones and friends who have fallen prey to QAnon or other like destructive conspiratorial cults. It's like, the proper answer is not to completely reject them and alienate them from themselves, but actually like say like, hey, like whenever you choose to come back and whenever you choose to see things in a different way, whenever you choose to, um, like just get out of that mindset, we're still here for you. Your place here with us, with your community, with your friends, with your family is still safe, and we will hold you and hug you whenever it is that you choose to come back.
Yeah, that brings up two things for me. So the first is, you said your community brought you back, but what I'm seeing a lot of is that, in quarantine, a lot of us are super alone, and then online, people are finding community in these conspirituality circles. So it's, they may feel as though like that, they've so far abandoned their community that if they left that, maybe they have nowhere to go back to. Like that feels like their new family. And so how could we address that?
Yeah, I mean that's just the ABC of how cultic groups operate. Like cults always prey on the vulnerable. The pandemic and the isolation definitely have massively increased the number of alienated, lonely, and disconnected people that remain vulnerable to be preyed on by harmful and destructive cults such as QAnon, obviously. Not only QAnon, there's many more of those. This is just something that is very relevant for us in the conspiritual circles. But again, it all comes back to like the loneliness and the alienation. Like I think it's something that people tend to forget because of the hyper and individualistic mindset that many of us have lived in hyper competitive societies for too long. But humans, like Margaret Thatcher, the English Prime Minister, she used to say that society is an abstraction. I like to think about it the other way. I think the individual is an abstraction. We are inherently social mammals. Our limbic systems are wired for social connectedness. Yeah, like we cannot really be happy and healthy and thrive if we are not well embedded and connected to other people. And that is not only our immediate nuclear family, which is already a disastrous mindset, but a much wider mindset, a much wider community. So what we're seeing nowadays, as you mentioned, is this relatively new phenomenon of memetic tribes, as has been described in some communities. So these memetic tribes are basically online communities that form around certain ideals that are propagated as memes online. Yeah, the problem with social media and the problem with online groups is that obviously they don't really fulfill the basic needs of actual living sentient mammals. They don't really fulfill our sense for meaningful community and meaningful connectedness. They just provide a cheap substitute, which makes it much easier for our brains to be hijacked by bad ideology and bad ideas.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate you bringing up that entire aspect of it. Like what may feel like connection is not what truly our like mammal internal self and primate brain responds to as true connection. I wanted to ask one more question about when you were getting out. If you are in a mindset where you're feeling messianic, right? Like I know more than everybody else. And I see this a lot with, the, let's say, Q or anti-maskers calling, so let's say the rest of us, people outside of the conspiracy, calling us outside of the conspiracy, calling us sheep. So
Yeah.
if you are in this messianic thing where you feel as though you know all the secrets, right? That's what generally it is. Like I've seen behind the veil or through the veil or whatever. And then your family who are just, normal people, right? And they're trying to tell you like, look, come out of here. How do they get through to somebody who thinks they're above the people who are trying to help them?
How do you get through to a person who thinks they're above the person that is trying to help them?
Yeah, like you said, your family was like, please come back. But I'm imagining if you're at like Adam the Messiah and you're like, oh, these sheep want me to come back to their small way of thinking, like how, they're essentially saying, we know the right way. And I imagine if somebody's all the way to, some of these conspiracy, they think they know
Yes.
the right way. How can that be, that impasse be worked through so that the person can come back?
I don't think there's a very straightforward way to do any of it, other than just like really holding space and embodying patience and empathy. Yeah, like it will be, and it is very difficult to deprogram somebody has been hijacked by ideology in that sense. Luckily, life happens and reality happens, and this is something that we are seeing right now with all the people who got hijacked by Q. Like nothing actually happened. Like it was like the very obvious thing that we all expected. And like some people are still in it. Like some people are still rationalizing all of these things and still spinning stories to accommodate, their desperate need for belief and for ideology, as if this is still playing out in some ways. It was necessary for Biden to be elected president because that's the only way that the actual, light workers are gonna whatever. So there's a few number of QAnons that are still deep into it, believing that this is still how things are playing out. So it is very difficult to like deprogram somebody rationally or directly. But again, like life happens, reality happens. People are gonna be confronted with the fact that whatever belief system they bought into is just a bogus belief system. So the only thing really that people can do is to be patient and to be loving and to be supportive and to be empathetic and to understand that we're all, everybody, every single person, we're all vulnerable to believe dumb things. Yeah, we're all vulnerable. We're all vulnerable at some point in our lives to buy into bullshit ideologies. We're all vulnerable to like have that need for a story, even if it's not true.
Yeah.
And the only response for that really from people who want that person's best interest is just to hold that stage in their development with empathy and compassion and patience. And again, like just reassuring them, like, hey, I understand where you're going through. I know that you can't see that yet. I know that you can hear what I'm saying. I just want you to know that whenever you do hear me and whenever you do see that and whenever you do have that like inevitable disenchantment or disillusion with whatever story it is that you're engaged with right now, I'm still going to be here. And I'm still going to be holding space for you. And your place in your family and your place in your community is still safe. And we will nurture you back to good health and good epistemic sense.
I love that. Good epistemic sense. So I want to back up a little bit and go into some of because we talked a lot about, conspirituality right there. Let's get back a little bit into how it intersects with psychedelics. And I wanted to read this paragraph. So Martha Alit wrote this fantastic article for the psychedelicsrenaissance.com, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But I wanted to quote a little section here. And she's talking about how psychedelics are renowned for their ability to induce ego death. So a lot of us, if we've done psychedelics, when we've gotten to that point, all of a sudden you're no longer, this body or this name that somebody's given you. It's just, you're kind of a bunch of nothingness, and you lose that sense of self, which some people think, oh, now I don't have an ego. Well, as she says, this doesn't mean that it wipes the slate clean of your ego. And then and I'm going to say a quote here. She's a quote, one inhalation on a DMT pipe is unlikely to fully remove such an ingrained, crucial survival mechanism. She said, furthermore, temporarily quieting the ego could cause an elastic band effect where it bounces back even stronger than before. And she also said, not to mention that psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers, meaning that they exaggerate already existing narcissism. So, does that resonate with you? Some of that like rebound ego effect that she's talking about?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I hadn't heard it referred to in that way, but like she said, this is an ingrained survival mechanism that if you take it away is going to fight back and probably reinforce itself in a way that is going to be harder to knock down the next time. And I can imagine if you do that enough times, especially, a lot of people do repeat psychedelics for many different reasons, but if it gets stronger and stronger each time, then we could lead to some of these issues we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great topic and so many different directions that I can take from here. I don't even know where to start. I think the one that I would choose, and maybe this is like tangentially related, so you can draw me back to the main question later. The one thing that I'm thinking of is the fact of how these experiences have been for millennia probably embedded within wisdom traditions that are inherently relational. Yeah. So, for example, this experience of ego death that we can have through a psychedelic experience, that has stood as the cornerstone of pretty much any initiation in thousands, if not more, of wisdom and spiritual traditions in the world. Yeah, from the ancient Egyptian rites to the Elysian mysteries of Greece and so on and so forth. Like that experience of death and rebirth is probably the epitome of any spiritual or mystical experience that people have sought throughout human history. Now, the thing about these experiences is that they were embedded and supported by ritual, by ceremony, by a structure that directed that experience towards a particular outcome, which oftentimes was an initiation for that person to move through stages in their lives. It wasn't just something that somebody did in a basement in Brooklyn just for the sake of it, without really understanding the consequences of that experience. Yeah. So the community, the society, supported that experience by giving it a particular meaning and by providing that person with a particular narrative that allowed that person to make sense of that experience according to a very particular worldview. Most of those worldviews have to do with relatedness, togetherness, and so on and so forth. If you look, for example, ayahuasca, which is the field that I'm lately more interested in because I've been living in the rainforest for 4 years working with ayahuasca. If you think about ayahuasca, most traditional uses of it by Amazonian indigenous people, the main focus of it has always been relational. Yeah, ayahuasca is a tool and a plant that has allowed people for centuries to basically work on keeping a harmonious and balanced relationships amongst the people from the tribal group, but also what they consider to be non-human people, right? Which is the rest of the natural world. Amazonian ontologies are very relational in that sense. There's human people, but there's also non-human people. The trees, the plants, the birds, the rivers, everything is alive and sentient. Everything has a spirit. Everything is, in a sense, human, just dressed differently. Yeah. So the river is exactly as you are. It's just dressed in a different way that you are. Yeah. That's kind of like the gist of an Amazonian ontology made easy. And a tenet of animistic societies in general, but particularly in Amazonian worlds, is that the primary imperative, like the philosophical or ethical imperative, is always to maintain harmonious relationships of balance and reciprocity amongst all sentient human and non-human beings. And ayahuasca has been, used in that sense primarily to facilitate communication between the human community and the human and the non-human communities. So in its essence, it's relational. Ayahuasca is not traditionally used as a tool for individual healing, individual growth, self-knowledge, all of these things that the Western mindset has kind of imposed on these practices has not necessarily been true or at least not the main focus for the traditions from which that originates. So the relational aspect of it ensures that when people have these experiences, which can very well be experiences of like ego dissolution or so on and so forth, they are embedded within a story, they're embedded within a practice, they're embedded within a ritual, they're embedded within like human and non-human relationships that ensure that that person doesn't go off on some sort of like individualistic, egoic, narcissistic inflation.
Yes.
That's a short answer.
Th-
Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm picturing it as, I've been to, let's say, near ego death states where all of a sudden I'm like, oh man, I should be friends with the plants. Like I totally get that, and I see where that would have that function instead of like, oh, now I should go back and I'm on a, like, as the article goes on to point out that a lot of times that you come back from seeing these things and you feel like you said in your own description, now I'm the chosen one. Well, I got to ego disillusion and I saw that I'm one with God and I have the, and if somebody else hasn't seen that, well, let me not only tell them that, they need to so they can get up on my level, but I think then that's where we start tipping into this other area that I would like to touch on, where people who do enough of these experiences, and like you said, and we want to couch this, and I'm glad you mentioned this, is that these experiences are very powerful and they need to be done in very conscious ways with integration and preparation and people to hold you and give you frameworks within which to examine your experiences, or else that, then we're much more likely to have them go unchecked into narcissism, etc. And so if people have enough of these kind of unconscious, ungrounded, no framework experiences, I see that leading, even in my own communities, to people suddenly wanting to claim that they are able to give the medicine. And this leads into kind of like the self-titled shamans, right? Like, I am fairly certain the Q shaman has not spent 4 years in the Amazon researching anything like you have. And is at least the small amount of research I did on him for this. But if we could talk a little bit about, how you've seen that progression, because I'm sure in your communities you've seen some of the same thing. Is like people have a few psychedelic experiences and then they put themselves on a little bit of different level, and then that ends up doing more harm to the community. When, let's say, essentially unhealed people turn themselves into healers and then seemingly, can manipulate others or have other negative effects on the community.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of a story that is more related to the previous point. I'm just gonna go through that very quickly. I think it was, but I am gonna elaborate on that point. I think this is. I'm trying to remember exactly how the story goes, but I think it was Ram Dass and Ram Dass's brother, who after coming back from India and so on, after having psychedelic experiences, like Ram Dass's brother ended up in a psychiatric institution. So when I may be butchering this story, but I think this is how it goes. I think when Ram Dass went to visit him and he asked his brother like, "Hey, what's going on?" and his brother said like, "Everything is fine. It's just that I found out that I am Jesus Christ." And then Ram Dass goes, "Oh, yeah, and so am I, you know." And then his brother says, "Well, then why is it that I'm here, institutionalized in the psychiatric hospital and you're not?" And then Ram Dass answered, "Well, that's because you think that you're the only one." Yeah. And I think that's kind of like a very beautiful story that
Yes.
it illuminates this aspect of messianic inflation and spiritual narcissism. Like people come to these realizations about whatever they want to call it, their true nature, their higher self, whatever. But it is easy to think that we're exceptional, whether actually we're not. Like we're all the same. We all have the same nature. Going back to your other point about the self-proclaimed shamans. I mean, shaman is a stupid word, to be honest. Like just starting from there, I mean, shaman is overused. It doesn't have any real anthropological meaning whatsoever. I mean, the word shaman is a word that originates from Siberian cultures that denominate a very particular, role that those Siberian cultures have, which is somewhat similar to other roles or other animistic, societies or cultures may have, but kind of like anthropologists a very long time ago universalized that word to refer to a huge variety and multiplicity of different roles that actually are very different amongst them. Yeah. So I mean, it's not a word that has a lot of explanatory value. It's just a cliche by this point. But if we're gonna use it anyway, like one good way to see it is that in traditional societies, for the most part, really, there isn't such a thing as a self-proclaimed shaman. Yeah, a person doesn't wake up one morning and is like, oh, like I'm the shaman now. Like that's a title or a role or a recognition that is given to that person by the community. And again, we go back to that relational aspect, that we have completely lost in our hyper-individualistic, alienated society. It's like, yeah, like if you want to be something for that community, that's not up for you to decide. It is a title or respect or a position that you are given by the mere, nature of your community recognizing you as such. So if because of your virtue or your ability or your training, you're able to provide some service for your community and the community recognizes that service as meaningful and beneficial, then, they may recognize you as that person who holds a role. Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of like the main, I guess, difference, which is actually not trivial. It's a huge difference. Yeah. Because it goes from like a messianic inflation or egotistic narcissism, saying, oh, like I'm a shaman now, to like, no, like I am just a person who provides a service that my community finds helpful and beneficial and meaningful. So they give me that recognition or that title or that label. So, but yeah, I mean, again, like, we're touching again on kind of like that alienation and loneliness. And a lot of that comes from this hyper individualistic competitive society where all of us are under a huge amount of pressure to be special and be unique and be something and have titles, and we want to have something that identifies us as. I mean, a lot of this is also virtue signaling, right? Like if I call myself a shaman, then I'm virtue signaling to people that I consider to be part of my community. Like, hey, like I know things. I'm into the secrets of whatever esoteria my community values, right? So I mean, there's a lot of aspects of it which are not necessarily real in the sense of I'm actually providing something that is recognized as valuable and helpful by others, but something that only serves kind of like my own delusions of grandeur.
Yes, absolutely. By the way, thank you for that thorough explanation of shaman, because I think people don't, I mean, I even see people talking about, this is a question I have for you, but well, okay, I'll ask the question second. First off, most of the people who we give the title to actually have a technical title like curandero or taita or something that describes the type of medicine that they're serving, correct? And then on top of that, the community will then refer to them as shaman, but it's not like they didn't have, they themselves might say, I refer to myself as a curandero. That's their training has given them that title. And then shaman is something the community calls. Whereas a lot of the self-proclaimed ones, there's no lineage that they're coming from, no training. It's just like, as the article I think said, they've combined some pagan things, they've grabbed some Buddhist things, maybe some Indian philosophy, and then suddenly they're giving ceremonies and they're a shaman. My question that's only slightly tangentially related, but I'm curious, is when people say like, oh, I'm trained in shamanic healing. So I have been on this path to try to find certain types of somatic therapist for integration, because a lot of people come to me for that. And so I'm going through people's credentials on the regular, and I see like trained in shamanic therapy, shamanic healing. If shaman is not a term that's associated with anything outside of Siberia, is there such thing as even shamanic healing or shamanic therapies?
I mean, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, again, like, I mean, things exist by virtue of us naming them in many ways. Like language in many ways creates reality. So if we have a social convention that this term is meaningful, then it will become meaningful. What the actual essence and substance behind it, that's a whole different story. Yeah, so I mean, there's a whole other thread that would probably take a lot of
separate episode, but
podcast to unravel.
Yeah, since you've been doing the research on the Amazon, I just like, if there happened to be a shamanic way of healing that I didn't know about, I just wanted to hear about it before, because I assumed that it was just something that like, okay, we've combined a lot of things together. They have a lot of these esoteric qualities. We're calling it shamanic healing, and then that's another thing that a lot of these articles are talking about is even the QAnon shaman, he was selling courses on how to be whatever he was, for $44.44. And that's the issue, is like once he's named something a shamanic healing course and then somebody else takes it, well, then they're a trained shamanic healer, etc. And so I think part of what I'm happy that you're bringing up and that I want the listeners to think about is when you're looking at somebody and their qualifications, if you're trying to find a psychedelic integration coach, or if you're going to do a ceremony and you're going through, as we've talked about on previous episodes, going through their credentials, make sure that these are credentials that are legitimate and not that they perhaps made up themselves or somebody else made up one generation before them and gave them that credential. I think some friends of mine, very often people come to me like, what do you think about this healer? And the email that they showed me had a bunch of like emojis of crystal balls and references to moon dust. And I was like, well, you lost me at both of those. I was like, nothing about the medicine that you're trying to do involves needing moon dust or, crystal balls or whatever. Like, just evaluate, because a lot of this iconography we become very familiar with, like in the spiritual world, and we think it lends some kind of credence to somebody's character or somebody's training. And I just ask people to look a little bit level, deeper. Don't just tell me how many ceremonies you've done, but really what is the training you've had, and don't be too fooled by the titles that people are giving themselves at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is again like a whole thread that we can unravel. Like this very dark and catastrophic conjunction between New Age conspirituality and narcissistic psychedelia, and also capitalism. Yeah, and this need for people to monetize whatever illusion and fantasy they have created for themselves. The one advice that I always give people who ask me about working with a particular person or where can I find somebody trustworthy in such and such place, my first advice is always take your time. Yeah, like ask around. First, connect with your local community. Nowadays there's community pretty much everywhere. If you're in LA, if you're in Denver, if you're in Portugal, or if you're in Bali, it doesn't really matter. First, take time to create social relationships, create social bonds, connect with people, ask around. The best measure of whether somebody is genuine and helpful is not whatever credentials or titles he assigns to himself, but rather what other people feel. So, you will know a tree by its fruits. Has it really helped people? People are going to tell you. Has it, just swindling and whatever, then people are going to tell you. Yeah, so, I mean, that's kind of like the first measure. And I think that's the most important one, is like really the social aspect of it. And again, like this is very similar to how it happens endogenously in indigenous or traditional settings. Yeah, like it's word to mouth. It's not by what the person calls himself or herself or what the credentials or learning is, like actually what the community says. If you want to know where the shaman lives or where the sorcerer lives or where the brujo lives, you ask people in town. Say like, hey, like, do you know a good sorcerer? And then they point you out and say, hey, like, be aware of that person because so and so, or you can trust that person because so and so. It's always a social aspect to it that is primary.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. And so you brought up Los Angeles and Denver and Bali and Portugal. And so we've got a listener, say like in Kazakhstan, and who's not in necessarily, or Wichita, Kansas. The reminder is that there's a lot of, surprisingly, Facebook groups that have popped up around psychedelics and mental health, psychedelics and healing. It's not surprising that they popped up. It's surprising to me how open people are on them, which is great. Until it's not. But at that point, I think that's a good place if people are thinking, my particular town doesn't have a community like that. I mean, I can tell by the amount I lived in Austin and I was getting these questions all the time, and I didn't know who was around doing certain things because, this is all still very underground. But a lot of, if you are in one of these more remote places, try to seek out even maybe integration circles that are online, because that's like a small community that you can be part of that will hopefully help fill in those roles for people to do that social proof step that we're looking for. Because you're right, they could have all the credentials in the world, and if they mistreat their employees, then they may not be great people. Just like you go on a first date and somebody is rude to the waiter, they may be a rude person, right? They're like giving you their honeymoon face, and then you can see their true self. And for me, if I'm going to be in a ceremony where I'm heart open and spirit open and all those, I want toxic people as far away as possible. And I think that's, it's hard to judge if you're even on just a first meeting of somebody, but other people who have been through that ceremony have probably seen more facets of that person and would be better to weigh in.
That's a very interesting point, actually, and something that actually I do want to touch on, because a lot of this also is partly a result of our Western spiritual fantasies and projections. Yeah, we tend to have this idea that is very romanticized about what a guru is, or what a shaman is, or what like the ancient Vedic rishis of India were like, or these like wise old people that were gonna, tell us what the meaning of life is and rid us of all of our human problems and so on. When it comes to actual, medicine practitioners, this cannot be further from the truth. Yeah, these people are not enlightened beings. They're not even necessarily benevolent beings. Okay, there's a lot of contradictions and darkness in their humanity, and that's something that is beautiful, and that's just what it needs to be. So while it is important to always like look for people that actually have a good heart and have good intentions, also a lot of that is being aware of our own spiritual fantasies and projections, and understand that we're actually working with people who are just as flawed as any other people, and people who are also in many other ways probably more flawed than other people. Working with medicine practitioners or shamans doesn't mean that you need to find an enlightened being who is pure light and pure heart and whatever spiritual projections we want to place into them. Yeah, they're humans. Shamanism, if you want to call it something, if there's such a thing as shamanism, it's in its essence ambiguous and full of contradictions of dark and light. Yeah, like sorcery and black magic are incredibly more prevalent than healing in Amazonian cultures, for example. Like the big majority of services that somebody will provide are about like love magic and sorcery, and in like healing is kind of like almost afterthought in many cases. Obviously when working with Western people, things change because we're interested only in very specific things that align with our spiritual fantasies. Yeah, we want like that deep healing, we want that personal growth, we want all of that kind of like enlightenment and awakening and whatever buzzwords New Age gives us, but very rarely black magic and sorcery and love magic are things that we seek. And that's actually primary and prevalent for many Amazonian cultures, for example. So I think it's very important that people understand the reality of what actually is happening under these beautiful stories that are very marketable and sexy, but not actually true. Yeah, shamanism is ambiguous. Is like all of these medicine cultures are ridden with paradoxes and contradictions, and that's just the way that they are. And it isn't about like anything other than just accepting that. So I think a lot of this conspirituality and a lot of this kind of like narcissism, a lot of this inflation comes from a deep misunderstanding of what wisdom means. Yeah. And the spiritual projections that oftentimes we put on people as if they were responsible to show us the true way or show us the path or show us our true self, whereas in reality they're just providing technical services for the most part.
Yeah, that's a good point, and great for setting expectations. Like psychedelics are not easy. There's a lot of self-work to be done, and that person is not going to cure you. They are, like you said, technically they are going to, hopefully depending on the lineage, they will do things that will help you have a more enjoyable and maybe more beneficial journey. But they're not doing many times, most times are not doing the healing for you directly. Like you're doing your own inner work. So we've talked a lot about more of the dark sides of things. There's one article and so somebody asked me about this, and they're like, do you think, psychedelics make people more or less narcissistic? And I had remember seeing an article, and so I've looked it up. So we can end on a lighter note here, because it's not all bad news. I think I wanted to highlight, we have a mutual friend, Joelle, who was the guest who was on for the How to Choose a Facilitator episode, if you all have listened to that episode. But he put a post on Facebook, and it's in the first, it's like a cartoon. In the first frame, the person's like, I think I'm done with my ego. And it shows him like jumping off his something titled the regular ego, and then the thing below it that he lands on is called the spiritual ego. And I think that's funny because you were talking about like different types of wisdom, and I think, our when we start to get into this, working on ourselves, etc., we think, oh, we've dumped that ego that says, oh, I have to have a Ferrari, and like the kind of like very stereotypical 1980s ego. But now we've got this whole new ego, like, oh, who can be the wokest, and I've done so many ceremonies, and I've ego dissolved and this and that, and there's a whole nother level of ego that we've like changed one for the other, and it's still an ego and still something that has all the impacts an ego has. But I wanted to bring up this study that showed that, and I kind of like the title of the study, Broadening Your Mind to Include Others, the relationship between serotonergic psychedelic experiences and maladaptive narcissism. And the conclusion was that recent experiences with the classic serotonergic psychedelics, DMT, psilocybin, I believe LSD, associated with they were associated with decreased exploitative entitled narcissism. That was the subset of narcissism that they were associated with, a decrease in exploitative entitled narcissism. However, they found that actually having ego dissolution did not have the same effect. So I think I'm not really sure the methodology. It was like many dollars to buy the entire article, but I'd be interested to see if like people, so they're saying if you have one of these experiences, maybe without ego death, it was leading to this decreased narcissism. But once the ego death gets into play, again, maybe that rebound effect happens. But the bright side of this coin here is that there is a possibility, because psychedelics can show us that feeling of connectedness, or can not show us, but like empower that feeling of connectedness that you would think would lead to less narcissism, right? In theory.
No, absolutely. I mean, again, I think this is the main point of all of this, is that all of these experiences by themselves can be great. And again, going back to Jung's dictum, like we have to be aware of unearned wisdom. And I think what it means is really that having these experiences by themselves does not necessarily mean spiritual growth or psychological development or any enhanced benefit if we're not constantly, painfully mindful of how we actually integrate and embody those things in daily life over very long periods of time. These are lifetimes of integration and embodiment. And when it comes to ego dissolution, that's a tricky one. Oftentimes also because we don't really understand what we mean when we say ego. Ego is a very abstract, ambiguous word. We have different understandings of what ego is. We have the Freudian understanding of ego, a Jungian understanding of ego. We have like the more colloquial understanding of ego, the spiritual understanding of ego, which is the ego is bad and needs to be dissolved and needs to be destroyed, so you can actually experience the unity of all things and so on and so forth. So when people say ego death or ego dissolution, oftentimes they refer to very different things. So we don't have a unified understanding of what ego is. But I think at least in the psychedelic experience, it's just like that dissolution of the sense of I, that can be very beneficial when we integrate that correctly and we understand that we don't have to constantly be identified with that presence, as it were, that homunculus inside of our head that is constantly redirecting our attention towards me. Yeah, like the dissolution of the ego can point out towards the fact that actually, like this sense of identity is illusory, and even when it is extremely beneficial and extremely necessary for navigating daily life, we can always take some intellectual distance, as it were, from it, so we can actually examine it and not become over-identified with it. That would be like Jungian. A Jungian interpretation, for example, is that we can create distance so we don't become over-identified and we can become inflated with that identification with the archetype of the self, right? And then we leave more room for ambiguity, we leave more room for lightness, we leave more room for mystery, we leave more room for humor, which is something that we haven't touched at all, but something that is extremely important for me. And I want to say that just as my prescription, or at least the way that I have actually always recommend for myself and for others to deal with spiritual inflation, with narcissism, and so on and so forth, is through humor. I think humor is the most powerful tool that we have, particularly self-humor, like humor about ourselves, like the ability to laugh about our own bullshit and laugh about our own absurdity, and always having that as that saving grace when we start becoming too certain about something, and when we start becoming a little bit too self-conceited, when we start becoming a little bit too self-aggrandizing, then being able to laugh about it and say like, oh, actually, I can recognize that I have, gone into the deep end of my messianic delusion. Ha ha ha, so funny, back to normal. Yeah, which is something that is massively lacking in many of the new age circles, which actually glorify seriousness and glorify kind of like that narcissistic approach of always having to be doing the work and always having to be engaged in some sort of like self-improvement or healing path or whatever, and very, very, very little or very, very, very little just fun and play and laughter, which are the natural antidotes and the natural protective factors against ego inflation.
Well, that's fantastic. I like your prescription. I think that's a perfect place
Yeah,
to end. Well, thank
great.
you. It's beautiful. Adam, a lovely discussion as always. I always enjoy talking to you. Can you let people know where they can find your work?
Yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of different things that I've published. There's articles, there's book chapters. My PhD dissertation is forthcoming, hopefully beginning of next year. The one place that I would recommend people looking it up is my social media, probably my Instagram. My Instagram has a link tree in it where you can find links to all of my published articles and so on and so forth. So my social media would be a good place. I am on the process of creating my website. As soon as I have that ready, I will communicate that. But yeah, my link tree is on my Instagram page, so
What
you
is
can
your
post my Instagram and
What is your
it's
Instagram page? In case people
it's
are not driving with the show notes.
at Adam Andros. So it's Adam Adam. Andros is Andros.
Perfect. Thank you
And then
very
you can
much.
find my link tree. Yeah,
All
my
right.
pleasure as always.
Go check out Adam's link tree and and laugh more. And Adam, I appreciate as always you coming on and chatting with us.
Yeah, of course. It's my pleasure. Yeah,
Well,
and take care of each other. I mean, that's the main thing. Like if we do these things together in community, there's less chance for people going on an individualistic messianic rants. Yeah,
I like it. I like it. Awesome. Thank you, Adam.
yeah,
And for everybody else out there, until next time.
yeah.